The book we read for class, Deadly: How Do You Catch an Invisible Killer by Julie Chabarro, is a historical fiction novel about the typhoid epidemic caused by Mary Malone. This book, which takes place in New York City in the early 1900s, uses a diary format to tell its story. The diary is kept by the protagonist of the story, Prudence, who is a Jewish girl troubled by the prevalence of death and disease and fascinated by medicine and the idea of the eradication of illness. Prudence's story deals expertly with the limitations of poverty and gender, showing what life was like for the poor and for women in the early 1900s. During the course of the story, Prudence is hired as an assistant by the New York Department of Health, where she works for Mr. Super, who is investigating the source of a typhoid epidemic. As Mr. Super and Prudence dig deeper into this, they discover Mary Malone, a middle-aged Irish immigrant who cooks for the wealthy and has worked for many families who contracted typhoid. They eventually discover that Mary is the cause, and she becomes the first person identified as a typhoid carrier. New York City was still very large and impressive in the early 1900s. This photo of New York City was taken from a balloon in 1906, which is the setting of the book. These two images show other parts of New York City in 1906. The image on the left is of Fifth Avenue and the image on the right is of Central Park. This short silent film was made by Thomas Edison and takes place in New York City in 1901. Watching this film, we can see how people of this time dressed and interacted with each other. We can also see that although cars do exist at this time, horses are still a popular mode of transportation. These two photos, one of men sleeping on the floor of a New York homeless shelter in 1885, and one of people living in a crowded one-room tenement in New York in 1885, are both from Jacob Riis's book How the Other Half Lives, which is referenced in the novel. Jacob Riis's book, which described the living conditions of the urban poor, is mentioned throughout Deadly, and Prudence's mother explains on page 29 that his book was motivation for drastic improvements in the area in which they live and the surrounding tenements. Tenements, the type of housing that Prudence lives in, were poorly constructed and often had many people crammed into very small spaces. They came about because of the increase in immigration, and they were not very sanitary or pleasant to live in and led to an increase in infectious diseases and a high death rate. After the publication of How the Other Half Lives, the Department of Health was founded and more regulations led to improvements in tenement living, which altered the area from the place Prudence's mother knew to the more pleasant but still poor area Prudence grew up in. Because this novel is set in the early 1900s, there are many terms that are a little dated and hard to understand. A couple of the more unusual ones are organ grinder and hurdy-gurdy. These two words first appear on page 24 of the book when Prudence writes, "The repeating tunes from Mr. Zito, the organ grinder, and Mr. Victor, the hurdy-gurdy player, and the clatter of horse hoofs on the cobblestones create a noise so great from the street tonight that I cannot sleep." From this we can deduce that the organ grinder and the hurdy-gurdy player both produce music, and the two pictures on this slide show the organ grinder on the left and the hurdy-gurdy player on the right. In Deadly, Prudence works as an assistant in the Department of Health, and her desk or office may have looked very much like the one in this photo of a man reading typewritten pages in the early 1900s. Because this was well before any type of computers, there was a lot more paper involved in paperwork, and this can be seen in the files and posts on the wall in the picture. The images on this slide show cars in the early 1900s, similar to the ones that Prudence describes riding in the novel. Prudence calls cars locomobiles and refers to the specific car owned by Mr. Super as a Stanley steamer. Prudence explains on page 59, "I had never been so close to an actual locomobile. They're always passing so rapidly on the streets and seem so unstable, as if they may explode any second." Cars were nowhere near as common in Prudence's time as they are now, as we can see from her reaction to seeing a car up close, and from the silent film earlier in the presentation that showed horse-drawn vehicles as being much more common. By the end of the novel, Prudence has decided that she is going to study medicine, and one of the books she is given to read is The Effect of Germs in Everyday Life, which was written by Dr. Louis Pasteur, the man pictured to the left. The picture on the right is a photo of what typhoid bacteria looks like through a microscope. This is the kind of bacteria Mary Malone was the carrier of and spread to the people she cooked for. When Mr. Super, Dr. Baker, and Prudence are finally able to catch up with Mary Malone, the only way they can get her to come with them is with the help of the police, a decision that Prudence is deeply conflicted about. The picture on the right of this slide shows a police wagon from the early 1900s, probably similar to the one Mary Malone rode in. It was still drawn by horses at this time, and the men pictured in the photo are policemen of the time. The picture in the lower left corner shows the policemen's parade on Fifth Avenue in New York, also in the early 1900s.